It's February the 12th, 2016. I'm Cheryl Gray McDonald, and I'm in Elizabeth City, North Carolina, speaking with Miss Leona Williams. Good morning, Miss Leona.
Good morning.
May I ask, when and where were you born, and where did you grow up?
I was born at Avon, North Carolina, March the 14th, 1921.
Okay. What were your parents' names? Where did they grow up, and what did they do for a living?
Leona Gaskins was born at Hadras, and excuse me, and George Harrison Meekins was born at Avon.
Okay. What did they do for a living?
My mother was, I'll say, an LPN. She went to St. Vincent Nursing School, stayed there for not quite a year, left there. She got tired of nursing. Then she went to the college at Petersburg. It was a Methodist college. She got a degree, not a full-time, but enough that she could teach. So she nursed for a few years and then would teach. During her time, she delivered 100 babies. She never lost a baby. She never had a preeclamptic mother or any mother with any disorder. And her fee was so small, it would be pathetic. But anyway, that didn't matter. She did it as a community project to help people. And she taught in the schools at Hadras, but Avon mostly. And when she was 9 years old, she left Hadras, her parents died, and she came to Avon to live with the Bateman Millers. Well, at 9 years old, when she came to Avon, she had played the piano from 9 years old till the rest of her life, till she got disabled, when I would say maybe she was 80. Maybe even 90, I think she still played the piano, but she always played in church. And the substitute was my sister, Mary Gray. If Mama wasn't there, why, sister would play the piano. So she was a busy lady, and she took care of 5 children. And she was as strict as any mother could ever be. So
she was an amazing woman.
She was.
Amazing. What about your father? What did he do for a living?
My dad, his parents were Isaac and Henrietta Meekins. And at a very young age, he joined the Coast Guard. And during that time, he built, when they were first married, he and my mom, he built our family, had it built our family home in Avon. And there's where they reared the 5 children, only when he was transferred somewhere, the family went with him. He always saw that before he left the island, he had a place for the family, so he would take us with him.
Okay. Okay. You mentioned that your father's parents were Isaac and Henrietta. And what about your mother's parents? What were their names, your grandparents?
George and George Gaskins and Mary, I believe, Gaskins.
Okay. Okay. Do you know, were they born down there, and what did they do for a living?
They were both born at Hatteras, but they moved to Black Mountain. They spent the remainder of their life in Black Mountain. That was Mama's stepmother.
Okay.
But her dad and stepmother spent the rest of their life at Black Mountain.
Okay. How old were you when you moved away from Avon?
Well, my first starting school, the first grade, was at Ann Street Methodist Church in Beaufort. That I started the first grade.
Okay.
Then we stayed there a few years, lived in Beaufort, and Dad was transferred back. So we went back to Avon. Then when as a teenager, he was transferred again to Beaufort, or Fort Macon was his station, and we lived in Beaufort again. So I had my either preteen, I'll say, schooling some there. Well, then he was transferred a few years later to Fort Macon again. So that time we had housing right at Fort Macon. And I went to school in Morehead City. That was my senior year. And I got my high school ring, which was so important, got everything, stayed to Morehead till about, I believe, 3 months before I graduated. Then he was moved back to Avon. Well, by the time I got back to Avon, my sister Mary had her first child, Irvie, and he was 2 pounds premature. Wow. So Mama went to our principal, which was Stanley E. Green, and she said to discuss what would happen if I went to New Jersey with Sister to help her with her premature baby. How would it affect my finishing high school? He says she'll get more education by going to New Jersey than she will staying here. So I went to New Jersey, spent time with Sister, which was, I think, maybe I'll say 2 months. But then when I came back the last month, I was preparing to graduate. So the object was at our graduation, we were supposed to write a thesis of, I've forgotten what the title had to be, but anyway, anybody that wrote the best thesis was to be valedictorian of the class. So my thesis was chosen the best by the judges. So that meant that I was valedictorian. So I graduated from Avon. But my mother helped me with my thesis, so I always kind of felt guilty even accepting it, because one girl in the class, I always felt like she deserved it. So that was my high school.
Oh, that's interesting. I'm sure you deserved it. I think you mentioned you may have lived at Little Kinnakeet Lifesaving Station area for a while. Do you remember much about that?
Even moved to Little Kinnakeet. That's where Daddy was stationed in. There was a couple houses up there, so he moved the family up there, and we would have to be brought back from Little Kinnakeet to Avon just during school year.
Okay.
So when we lived at Little Kinnakeet, I think our youngest, Georgia Russell, she was about 5 years old then.
Okay. Those houses are no longer there.
Oh, no.
Can you describe what they looked like, just briefly?
Just and more like modular home.
Okay.
They weren't high, weren't too high, highly elevated, but they weren't nice homes. They were just beach homes.
Okay.
But we had the conveniences. That
Sure.
was the best thing that we would have had in our home at Avon. But our dad was like that. Whenever he was transferred anywhere, the family went. And he was so wonderful about teaching us all to drive. We all learned to drive before we were teenagers. There wasn't any restrictions then. So that was a help to all of us.
You mentioned driving. The roads were not paved down there
No
then. So.
paved roads. And you could only drive around the community or maybe us to Buxton, not on off the island.
Okay.
Till later, till we got our driver's license.
Did a lot of people have vehicles then, or was it more?
Well, Daddy most always had a car, model A Ford, I think.
Okay.
So
Okay. You mentioned Stanley Green when you
He
went
was
back.
the
He was the
principal.
principal, yes. And he wrote a book called Kinnakeet Adventure, a book about coming to Avon in 1930 to be the school teacher and principal. And he stayed there till 1943. Kinnakeet, of course, is the historic name for Avon. Did you read the book Kinnakeet Adventure?
we had the book. I read it, and books are something that if you loan people sometimes, they don't return it.
I know.
So we don't have the book.
Do you recall if it was a pretty accurate description of the village at the time?
Well, I think probably so. I don't really remember too much about it.
Okay. Can you tell me anything about Mr. Green, his appearance, his manner, or other interesting observations?
He had never been married. And as far as he was always well dressed, real dark hair, had his mannerisms were always, but the boys in school would sort of wrestle with him jokingly, just he will tell you more. But he was a very nice person.
Okay. You moved around in your schools, but did you attend the old Kinnakeet School before it was destroyed in 1932?
Oh, yes.
Okay. Do you remember how it was destroyed?
By hurricane.
Okay. Where was it located, and what did it look
like?
By
almost where the fire station is at Avon now.
Okay, that's interesting. What about the new Kinnakeet School that was built afterwards? Where was that located? And what did it look like?
Right in the same area.
Okay.
But when that school was destroyed, we went to school in homes. We never stayed out of school. My mom let them have a room or so for grades, and one other I remember anyway. So we stayed in school even though the building was destroyed.
Okay, that's good. And you mentioned having to prepare a thesis. Did you have to also do an oration, a speech, when you graduated?
Definitely. And my mother had, I believe they called it elocution then. She had, when she was in college, that was one of her courses, and she'd have me stand before the mirror and read mine so many times a day. And so she helped us in every way. She was a mathematician. She helped all of us, the five of us.
She sounds like a wonderful person.
I
know I've heard people speak very well of her. Tell me about the stores in Avon when you lived there. Do you remember the names of the stores, who owned them, where they were located, and what they sold?
Well, the one we shopped from more was Gibb Gray. And it was called then Cat Ridge, and it wasn't too far from our home. And I remember we had a charge book where when you went to pick up what your mom wanted, you took a book and he put down the items,
Right.
So that was interesting. Then on what was called Cat Ridge, they had Fair Scarborough's store, which we did, I don't remember, but the main one was George O'Neill.
Okay, now where was George O'Neill's store?
That was right, but there was a bridge that separated Dog Ridge from Cat Ridge, and his was right off from the bridge on what I would say was Cat Ridge.
Okay, now you mentioned Mr. Gibbs' store was in Cat Ridge or Dog Ridge? Mr. Farah's was in Cat Ridge, right?
Dog Ridge.
Mm-hmm.
Dog Ridge was Mr. Gibbs. Okay. That's interesting. Do you, the area where Mr. Gibbs' store was Dog Ridge, and where Mr. Farah's store and down in that area was Cat Ridge. Do you know why those areas earned those names?
Well, I really don't, but as far back as I remember, they had those names. And it was like living in two separate communities.
Amazing.
And yet, where your mom and dad lived, that was, you might say, joined to both either, you know.
Okay.
That was called the Northern.
Yes, and the Northern they sometimes refer to as Spain. Do you know why
That's right.
it was given that name?
I don't know why.
That's always been a curiosity. Were there special places that you went to for recreation and entertainment, for games, sport, music, courting,
Well,
dancing?
We had a girls' team of playing ball. I don't remember, it maybe wasn't organized too much, and we swam. We learned to swim early. We were cautious, but we learned in the ocean. And then when we moved to other places, I could swim and really enjoyed swimming.
Okay. Did your family have gardens and livestock?
Oh,
and what
my
did they grow and
dad,
raise?
anywhere he had a garden as much as he could have, you know, at the time spent. And he had chickens. He even had ducks, you know, just so.
Okay. The foods boiled cornbread, pome bread, fig pudding are mentioned in Kinnakeet Adventure. Are you familiar with those dishes, especially
I should say.
the boiled cornbread is? What
No,
is that?
we baked cornbread.
Okay.
We made fig preserves, and Mama always had a lot, just pints of fig preserves, and that when anybody came, friends, she had friends from New York, around Elmira, New York, and every time they came, they took back figs.
Everybody loves figs.
Uh-huh.
What about pome bread? How is that made?
Cornbread.
It's cornbread.
Well, the way Mama always made hers was more firm, meal, flour, the yeast, tiny bit of sugar, and just baked it. I don't ever remember, like I've done, putting whole kernel corn in cornbread. That made it more delicious.
Okay, that sounds good. Did you and your family have any favorite meals, seafood or otherwise, with crabs or fish? And can you describe them?
Well, we had roast beef a lot. And my mom served anybody that came in. And seemingly, ministers especially, would all come by the house. And she always had food prepared. And her grandsons, they worked in Park Service at Buxton. So she would prepare for them every day. And sometimes they'd fail to come, and I remember she telling them one time, "You all messed me up. I prepare lunch for you, and you don't come." But she was a cook, and she enjoyed everything she did. But she had a habit that I've tried to follow so closely. No matter how many hours she worked in the morning, after her lunch meal, no matter who she fed, she always went in her bathroom, took a bath, put on fresh clothes, then she'd take a nap. That was the habit I remember always.
Can you tell me about yaupon tea and how that's made? Can you describe the taste? Was it a beverage you had at every meal?
To me, it was bitter. We did not. I think my dad would have maybe liked it, but we just never had it, only to try it, he had it given him a couple times, and but we never really liked it. It was bitter.
Okay. Do you remember the North Methodist Church and the South Methodist Church, where they were located? And why were there two Methodist churches in this village at the same time?
The Northern Methodist was a break-off from the other Methodist. And some people, I don't remember them having a big congregation because there were only, but that was Northern Methodist was a break-off from the United, I guess it was called then.
Okay. The Southern Methodist Church, was that where the current St. John's Methodist Church is located
That's
now?
right.
Okay.
Yeah, that's what it was, Southern Methodist.
Okay, and the Northern Methodist Church was located where?
Up on Cat Ridge, not too far, about maybe a city block and a half from the Sound, Pamlico Sound.
Okay. Tell me about major storms you have experienced in Avon. Are you familiar with the term land tide? And if so, what does that mean?
What?
Are you familiar with the term land tide?
No.
Okay. What storms have you experienced down there?
Well, we didn't pay too much attention as children to the storms. Our mother just seemed to take care of everything. We had a storm one time, and one of the fellas from, I believe it was Big Kinnakeet Coast Guard Station, came to my mother and said, "I came to pick up you and the children to take you to the station. Mr. Harrison is waiting for you." And my mother told them, said, "I'm sorry, but we're going to stay right here. I have the home to take care of." And when the water would start coming in the house, she would sort of sweep it out, but she always opened the door to let it in. Therefore, our home was one of 15 one time that didn't float because she opened the door and just let the water in.
Oh, how interesting. In Kinnakeet Adventure, Mr. Green stays at Mrs. Keaton's boarding house. Can you tell me anything about Mrs. Keaton or her boarding house and where it was located?
It was down near the Pamlico Sound, more south of,
South of maybe where the harbor is now?
no, further down, and right beside her house was friends of Mom and Daddy that would come from Washington. And right at the time, he was the Attorney General, but I've forgotten his name, I'm sorry.
Oh, that's okay. In the book Kinnakeet Adventure, Breeze Inn and Lover's Lane are mentioned. Can you tell me about either of those places and where they are?
I can't.
Or maybe they were fictional.
He could tell you.
What about the post office when you were a child there?
Well, the post office was just out where the hotel is now, around that, in that area.
Okay.
It was real small, and this lady ran it as far back as I can remember. Velma Williams,
Oh, yes.
Vera's sister.
Yes, okay. But you have no recollection of, well, do you remember where the mail came in? Did it
By mailboat.
came in by boat?
Down where Mr. Green lived, the lady he lived.
Okay.
Usually it was more down right on the Sound it came in. But
Okay.
he will tell you more. The first mail house was Vera's granddaddy ran it.
Okay.
And that was right down near the Sound.
Okay. Do you recall what the names of the boats were that carried freight, fish, mail, and transported people back and forth to and from Avon?
Well, I remember this. Every time my dad was transferred, we were moved on the AB-21, a large boat, and that's what the Coast Guard used to. That's the way we always went to Beaufort or Moorhead on the AB-21.
Okay. You mentioned the Coast Guard. Was that owned by the Coast Guard or a privately owned
I
boat?
think it was privately owned.
Okay. Can you tell me about traveling to other villages on Hatteras Island, the means of transportation, and why you would want to travel to the other villages, for example, to dances, to camp meetings, Old Christmas?
Yeah. Well, we always had a way, even though there was no highway. We may have to push a little if the car got stuck in, but we always, and that wasn't, so we were so young, we didn't know it was fun in a way.
I'll bet it was. How was Christmas celebrated in Avon? And
Christmas was mostly celebrated at the church. We look forward to it so much, just getting a little paper bag of mixed candy, maybe an orange or an apple, and then at home we hung our stockings, you know. It was, and some groups went out at Christmas time and would just walk the roads, but I don't remember they get up so early in the morning. We didn't do that.
Do you recall what life was like during World War II down there? Were there rations, blackouts, torpedoed ships offshore, or village men serving overseas?
But during World War II, we were living elsewhere. But you couldn't have even a light on at night. All we had was table lamps. But you couldn't have your light on. No light at all after a certain time because of fear, of submarines. Sure. And they were spotted, but I never knew of any difficulty on the island from them.
Okay. Can you describe how the landscape has changed down there? For example, the dike surrounding the village, of course the roads you mentioned earlier, vegetation, the creeks and the dunes.
Yeah, well, naturally they cut down so many of the trees as people would build. But, and after the highway came through, things were different. But I think for the better. But some of the homes that are still there, my home's still there that I grew up in. And it stayed the same for so long, but they would renovate and keep it up. But now it's just a gorgeous place. They elevated so high. And my niece takes care of it. She does all the work. She's an interior decorator, so she does a good job.
Is that Kathy?
Kathy.
Yes, that is a lovely house. Well, we're about to wind down, and do you have anything else you would like to share about growing up there or any old memories?
Maybe this isn't about. I went to Old St. Vincent de Paul Nursing School. I graduated. I nursed all those years after, and I did nursing for years in Elizabeth City when the children were growing up, and even after they started college and all. But I retired say, maybe 30 to 40 years ago.
Oh my goodness. Yes, I'm glad you brought that up because that was one of the questions I intended to ask, what you did for a living. And so nursing runs in your family.
Yeah, but there's one thing I would like to tell you,
Sure.
if I may, about your family.
Okay, sure.
Is that permissible?
That's perfectly fine.
Okay. When your mom, Carrie, you may want to turn it off.
No, go ahead. Let her record it.
Okay. When your mom, Carrie, came to Avon, she was beautiful, the most precious. And, her husband, he was always an outstanding person. But she reared all of you, and she had a nice family. One time we left Avon to come to Elizabeth City when my youngest son was 4 years old, and his imaginary playmate was Johnny Gray. He had to go to Weeksville to see Johnny Gray, but it was one of Kay's friends. I won't say boyfriend. But anyway, one thing I want you to know. your mama was loved. And later on, the only family I remember from coming from New Jersey was the sister.
My Aunt
And
Marie.
she came, stayed with your mom. And my sister Mary was so close to your mom. Your mom and dad and sister Irvin had always been so close. And I remember an older lady on Avon, she was nearing 90, and your mom's sister, while she was there, went to kind of help her out, and we'd visit her. So I'd go with sister to visit your mom's sister. But I want to put this in, something I will never forget. In fact, I probably have it somewhere in this house. At your mom's funeral service, it was the most, I never forgot it. I don't know how old I was. But she had written a piece of poetry that was put on, they didn't have bulletins then but on the church, I'll say bulletin. It was, I remembered it for years. She likened her trip to heaven as when she came to Avon, and on the Pamlico Sound she had to take, and that was her trip to Avon. She likened it to her trip to heaven, and the piece of poetry had something to do with the Pamlico Sound. That's one thing, that piece of poetry. But something else in her eulogy, as was written, this was the last short time of her life, and she says, my favorite evangelist is Jimmy Swaggart. She says, he's my minister, was my minister when I couldn't go to church. And his theme song was There Is a River. And I think she she wrote her own eulogy, and she brought in where the Pamlico Sound was the river that kept her surviving.
Oh, Miss Leona, thank you for your kind words about my family and my dear mother.
Well, it may be to you didn't plan on that, but to me, she was always so special, just a beautiful person.
She was to
She
me too.
reared children, and this, I want to tell you about your brother, Ellis.
Yes.
Ellis and Mary moved to Florida. When my sister was, I'll say, 95, all her life, up to 95, 97, Ellie and Mary would call her from Florida.
Yes, I knew that they did. They're very, very, very kind that way. Well, Miss Leona, thank you so much for the interview. I think we need to conclude due to time. And I do want to thank you for your wonderful stories.
Thank you for listening.
Great pause.